Good morning. I wish to thank the Minister of Economy of Luxembourg, Mr. Franz Fayot, for his kind words that are always, I find them always motivating and somehow inspiring, because they kind of bring me back to reality. They kind of reconnect my research activity with the needs of the policymaker, the needs of the public at large, and makes me feel like, you know, this work matters. Now, to move forward, I'm happy that we have successfully started our Measuring Progress annual workshop. It's great to welcome you all here. And without further ado, I would like to invite here our first keynote, Carrie Exton. Carrie Exton is the acting senior counselor and deputy director at the OECD WISE Center. For those who do not recall, the acronym WISE stands for Well-being, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity. WISE works to develop the evidence base for more people-centered and planet-positive policy solutions. You probably have read some of the reports, very insightful and rich. Carrie is also the overall editor for the How is Life series of reports. And she has more than a decade of experience in developing and analyzing WISE evidence. Today, she will speak about how to the work of the OECD in supporting the integration of well-being measures into policymaking. Over time, the measures of well-being have developed basically on two legs. On one hand, quantitative analysis, statistical analysis of what these measures have to say. On the other hand, what these measures can do for people. And Carrie has been very much active in recent years on supporting the integration of well-being into policymaking. Today, her speech is about how OECD member governments are defining and measuring well-being, and illustrate progress made so far in adopting policy processes to give people's well-being a more central role. Without further ado, I wish to welcome here Carrie Exton.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Francesco. Thank you, Serge. Thanks to the organizing team. Thank you to Minister Fayot for the excellent and very difficult to follow introduction. So I will do my best to try and outline some of the progress that we've seen towards better measures of well-being. I think we probably need to skip back for 1 second. So I'm going to outline some of the progress that we've seen so far, some of maybe the gaps that are still remaining. And I'm going to talk about what we're doing in the OECD, but I'm also going to talk about what some of our OECD member countries are doing. So a quick few takeaway points, because this is going to be a long presentation, and these are the key things to know about. In order to make well-being a concept that is operational for policy, we need to be able to measure it. That is straightforward. But the act of measuring alone does not change policy. So we need those measures, but we need a lot more than just those measures. In addition, well-being policy is probably not going to be a list of one-size-fits-all recommendations. And some of the real value in these beyond GDP indicators is about offering better ways of making policy decisions. So I'm going to talk about the 4 R's, using well-being in measures to refocus, redesign, realign, and reconnect policymakers with the public. I'll explain what that means in a little bit more detail later, but that's just one example of how we need to change the way we make decisions in government if we're going to truly integrate these measures in a fundamental way. Finally, I'm going to make the point that decision makers are at the point where they really need concrete tools to help them integrate well-being evidence. And we are seeing some concrete examples emerging in OECD member countries, and I will try and walk you through a couple of those. I'll start by giving just a little bit of history to the OECD context, just so you have a sense of where I'm coming from and the long-standing work that we've already been doing in this area. So we've been at this for, I would say, more than 20 years, in the sense that the OECD has, for a very long time, been looking at a variety of outcome measures above and beyond GDP. But we've really been accelerating that activity in the last 20 years or so. I think a key moment was the first OECD World Forum on Knowledge, Statistics and Policy in Palermo 20 years ago in 2004, 19 years ago in 2004, which really was a step change and the start of building a community of practice around this issue, both from a measurement perspective, but from a policy perspective, from an academic perspective, from a civil society perspective. And I'm really pleased to say that next year we will be having our 20th anniversary edition World Forum. So stay tuned for more details on that. In 2009, there was a very important report produced by Stiglitz-Sen and Fitoussi on economic performance and social progress. And this was something that the OECD supported through a secretariat. We then moved forward and responded to the recommendations in that report through a new initiative in the OECD called the Better Life Initiative, together with the How's Life report that started in 2011, and we've been producing every couple of years since then. In 2020, and another important milestone was the launch of the new WISE Centre. So this is the Centre for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equality of Opportunity. Now, this centre still has at its heart the importance of advancing the wellbeing evidence base and the measurement agenda. So we are not leaving measurement behind. We're really trying to catalyse and move that forward. We also do important work on benchmarking country performance on wellbeing so that this evidence can be integrated into things like the economic survey that the OECD produces for our member countries. We're also supporting member states in developing their own wellbeing initiatives. And again, I'll talk about that in a moment. But above and beyond measurement, the WISE Centre has its mission to transform wellbeing metrics into policy action. So above and beyond the measurement, we are looking at these tools for integrating this evidence more comprehensively, more systematically into decision-making in government, and indeed into OECD advice. So I think I keep skipping ahead, apologies. I'll pause here to explain how the OECD understands this word well-being, because I recognize that well-being is used a lot in a lot of different contexts, and sometimes we have a different mental model in mind when we hear that word. So this is the OECD framework for measuring well-being. We've had it since 2011. And as you can see from some of the icons here, it is multidimensional in the OECD context. So we have three main pillars. We have current well-being today in the top left here. We have a focus on inequality, so the distribution of those well-being outcomes on the top right. And underpinning all of this, we have sustainability. So under current well-being, you'll see that we've got a real mix of material conditions, what get called things like quality of life, so things like health, knowledge and skills, environment quality. And we've also got some relational dimensions of well-being, so things like social connectedness. And we've also got subjective well-being. So again, very difficult to talk about people's well-being without taking into account how people themselves feel about their lives. So subjective well-being is an important component of this model for us, but it is not the only thing we measure. We measure a lot of objective outcomes and their distribution in society as well. On resources for future well-being, we use the capitals approach, but we do not monetize everything. So we are very often referring to physical measures of these capitals, with the obvious exception of economic capital, because that's always measured in monetary terms. But here we're looking at natural capital, human capital, economic capital, and social capital. And again, I can give lots of more examples and descriptions of what we mean by that. But just to say, sustainability is underpinning our whole approach. The OECD Wellbeing Framework is a sustainable development framework. Again, I think within the different communities, there's a lot of different language, a lot of different terminology. We are incorporating subjective well-being, we are incorporating sustainability, but overall, we're looking at well-being for generations today and tomorrow. We're interested in outcomes, not just drivers. We're interested in inequalities, not just averages. And we look at subjective as well as objective outcomes. Just to say a word about where the conceptual framework came from. So this was originally developed in the OECD Statistics and Data Directorate in 2011, and it was done under the guidance of the OECD Committee on Statistics and Statistical Policy, which means this has been endorsed by the national statisticians of OECD member countries as the OECD approach to measuring well-being. As I mentioned before, it was a response to the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission in 2009, but it's also very much grounded in the academic literature that was present prior to the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission report, including welfareism, the capabilities approach, and emerging practice in OECD member countries. So there was a lot of international momentum around this by the time we developed it in 2011. We'd seen measures of progress being developed in stats offices in countries like the United Kingdom and in Australia. We'd seen Eurostat develop their quality of life work in 2015. There were various G20 initiatives, UN resolutions, Rio +20 on sustainable development. All of that momentum and all of the consensus that's occurred internationally around how to approach the measurement of well-being, we have tried to encapsulate in this framework. So we're really trying to kind of capture the essence of these different approaches and put it all into one place. Another important reference point for us was the UNEC Eurostat OECD Task Force on Measuring Sustainable Development, which again focuses on well-being here and now, later for future generations, and also elsewhere, so looking at transboundary impacts that countries have on one another. So these have also been foundational influences. It was developed in 2011, but we do our best to keep it current, including because so many OECD countries have developed their own well-being initiatives, both before and after our framework was developed. And it's really important to us, again, that we're reflecting best current practice with both the framework components itself, but also with the indicators that we use to measure those components. So I'll skip this slide because it just talks in some detail about some of the evolution of the framework over time. Again, there's many references for people who want more information about that. So just a word, I keep skipping, apologies. Just a word on indicator selection, because I'm aware there are some statisticians in the room, and this is quite important for us. Again, it's important here that we adopt the same rigor and the same international comparability standards for well-being that we do for other economic indicators. So we've been investing very heavily in trying to get the very best data available. And where there is no data, we've been working with countries to try and create data. So we have a framework for determining what indicators make the cut when we're reporting on well-being. But I would say, you know, this is hard to do in some of the dimensions of well-being that I've been talking about. So it's quite important. I'll come later. In fact, I might just jump later now. I'll hold my fire. But just to say that we've been working again closely with countries to try and improve the quality of the data that are available on well-being. The data that we have are all publicly available in a giant database of more than 80 indicators, disaggregated as many different ways as we possibly can. So by sex, by age, by education status, a couple of other variables where we can. And we're really trying now in our reports to include things like racial and ethnic disaggregations as well, because this is really important in our member countries. So all the time we're trying to improve the data and the disaggregation of the data that we can make available to people. But we have a very comprehensive dashboard of indicators, and I'd encourage anyone who's doing research on well-being who wants a time series going back to 2004 for at least 38 countries, please do take a look at our database because it's quite a useful resource for many people. A very quick flavor of what some of those 80 indicators include. This figure is from our country profile. We have country profiles for every OECD member country, and I think they're currently about 8 or 10 pages long. So there's quite a lot of depth in those country profiles. This is just one data viz from those profiles. And this is aiming to show Luxembourg's performance on well-being, both current well-being and inequalities, relative to other OECD countries. So longer bars always indicate better relative performance on these different indicators. So you can see, for example, that compared to other OECD countries, Luxembourg is very high on income and wealth, access to green space, has a relatively low gender wage gap, However, population exposure to outdoor air pollution is worse than the OECD average. Student skills in science, and in particular, the share of students with low skills are also fairly low. Housing affordability, gender gap in hours worked. So this is about unpaid work done usually in the household. So the gender gap between men and women on that. You'll also see that there are a number of white slices here. That means we've got no data available for Luxembourg. And I should probably check in with Francesco and Serge on this to see if there's any way we can maybe fill some of those data gaps with some of the data that you are producing. So this isn't a comprehensive picture. We have many, many more indicators that we look at, but this is just a sense of some of the headlines and some of the highlights. Similarly, we have a very comprehensive set of sustainability indicators on what we call our dashboard of resources for future well-being. So again, trying to get that current generations versus future generations. This is really what we are leaving behind, both actually for tomorrow and for future generations. So again, here we can see that Luxembourg is doing less well than OECD countries on average in things like greenhouse gas emissions, material footprint, household debt, which is also increasing at the moment, educational attainment, young adults, and also trust in others. By contrast, it's among the top OECD countries on fixed assets, financial net worth of government, and premature mortality. And again, I don't know if you can see because it's quite small, but we have little icons showing the direction of travel as well. And in the next edition of these country profiles, you will see trend lines to give a more fuller account of what's actually happening, because quite often these indicators are moving a lot in relation to economic and societal shocks. And we want to really show what you can do with these indicators over time, which I think is an area where there's not been enough focus, but we're now in a position, because we've been building this time series, we're now in a position to give a much better picture of trends over time. So anyone who loves data, anyone who loves data viz, I would urge you to take a look at the well-being reporting that the OECD does. So as I mentioned before, we have a long-standing publication called How's Life? We also quite recently produced a report on COVID-19 and well-being, which tries to track what happened to well-being during the pandemic, during certainly the first 18 months or so of the pandemic. And as I mentioned before, we have these really comprehensive country profiles. So if you want to know what's happening in your country on well-being compared to the OECD average, there's some data that you can look at. Last thing I really want to emphasize in terms of OECD work on measurement, before I get to the good stuff, is measurement guidelines. As I said before, we have a number of really important data gaps on well-being. There has been great progress in the last 10 or 15 years in terms of the data that's available through national statistics for measuring well-being. But we still continue to struggle on frequency, on timeliness, and sometimes even on the existence of data at all. So the OECD has had a big focus on working together with national statistical officers. This isn't the OECD on its own, it's very much partnership working to try and boost the availability, the consistency, the comparability of data on well-being. Because if we don't have better data, we will not be able to be on a par with the standard suite of economic indicators that are shaping policy today. Again, I will provide further details for anyone who wants, but there's a couple of different areas we've focused on. Things like the joint consumption, the joint distribution of income, consumption and wealth, but also the quality of the work environment, trust, and subjective well-being. And here I will raise a flag because we, those who follow our work, will be aware that the guidelines on measuring subjective well-being are now nearly 10 years old, and we are currently doing a review to understand how has the academic and research and government literature moved on since we wrote the guidelines in 2013. We'll be coming out with a working paper, I think around September 18th, that documents the uptake of these measures in countries. It documents how well people are following our recommendations currently, and it looks at some of the new frontiers of measurement and what we need to do if we potentially update the guidelines in future. So I know there's a number of subjective wellbeing experts in the room. I know some of you have probably all engaged with us on this process already, and if you haven't, I would really encourage you to do so. Right, okay, the bit that you've probably been waiting for, which is wellbeing approaches among OECD member countries. So as I said, the way that we work in the OECD is very much with and for our member countries, and we try and reflect the consensus position. So the work that we do is already reflecting the interests of our member countries. But above and beyond what happens in Paris headquarters of the OECD, there has been a lot of action on measuring well-being in our member countries. So today, more than 2/3 of OECD countries have developed national frameworks, development plans, or surveys with a multidimensional well-being focus. They don't always use the word well-being, so it's important. There are a set of criteria behind our selection of these examples here. So for example, you can see some of them use living standards, some of them do use well-being, some of them are focused more on sustainable development, but we're distinguishing this from the SDGs because obviously all member countries have work on SDGs. That's a separate approach, but it's actually very, very complementary. And again, all of these approaches are also very often looking at future generations and sustainable development within well-being. So as you can see over on the left, there were several countries who had activity in this space that well predates the OECD well-being framework. There was a lot of action around the time that the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi and the OECD well-being framework first dropped. But we've actually seen the most acceleration probably in the last 5, 6, 7 years. So this final column is the busiest, and again, very happy to share slides so that people can actually take this away and read it, because I recognize there are so many initiatives, you can't actually read them all if you're sitting at the back. But there has been a real shift in the number of countries who are taking this very seriously, who are measuring this in an official capacity within a government framework of some kind. And again, the OECD has been supporting very many of these initiatives, providing expert technical guidance, providing reflections on our own approach. So we're standing by to support countries in these endeavors. So just to give a flavor, because you've seen the OECD wellbeing framework, how does that compare to other people's frameworks? Canada, this framework was first released in 2021. It was developed by the Ministry of Finance in Canada, but it was actually very much a cross-Canada initiative. So the Ministry of Finance held the pen, but they involved very many other ministries in developing this. You won't recognize it from the components, but there is a lot of commonality with the OECD approach, with the Canadian framework. But what they have done, and I think it's possibly a lesson for us for the OECD framework in the future, is really try to condense down. So we have 11 areas of current well-being, we have 4 on sustainability, we have inequality. That's quite complex. Canada have tried to boil this down to 5. So they've said we care about prosperity, health, society, environment, and good governance. But if you look at the indicators that underpin those, they are very consistent with the indicators that the OECD is using. So this is a difference of framing in terminology rather than necessarily content. Importantly as well, there are 2 cross-cutting lenses that Canada applies. One is fairness and inclusion, which again is a cross-cutting lens through our own work. The other is sustainability and resilience. So rather than separating out current and future generations, Canada is actually blending those together. So in the context of society or prosperity, how do we think about that for generations today, but also for future generations? Another example here is the New Zealand Treasury's Living Standards Framework. Again, this was a Treasury-led initiative, but there was a lot of consultation that went behind this. And I think this is an especially interesting one for us because the 2018 edition of the Living Standards Framework very, very heavily borrowed from the OECD framework. They needed something very, very rapid to implement very quickly for the first wellbeing budget in 2019. So they took the OECD framework off the shelf and adapted it for the New Zealand context. But since then, they have continued the conversation with New Zealanders, and they've continued to adapt the approach to try and make sure that it incorporates what matters most in a New Zealand context. So importantly, the second iteration of the framework, which came out in 2022, incorporates elements of their child wellbeing framework and also their Maori framework, so their Indigenous framework for wellbeing. Again, in New Zealand, you've got the focus on current well-being at the top there, individual and collective well-being, and you've got a focus on wealth, so sustainability at the bottom. Interestingly, again, in the New Zealand framework, there is a focus on the institutions and governance that are needed to achieve these outcomes. So that's quite a unique and very interesting component that, again, was added in New Zealand. So I've just shown two to give you a flavor, but we have done some analysis of multidimensional wellbeing dashboards and the different shapes and sizes that they come in. This is quite an old figure. We do need to update this figure, but it still is effective in showing you that, okay, so the axis at the bottom here is showing you the number of indicators that are featured in these frameworks. So you can see here that we range from 10 or 12 at the top there in terms of France and Italy, and that's the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance set, because down at the bottom you'll see Italian again having 130 indicators in the National Statistical Office data set. So Italy has two versions of its equitable and sustainable well-being. One is run by the Statistical Office and is a very comprehensive monitoring dashboard. One is a short set that the Ministry of Economy and Finance used to integrate in budget. And again, there's some work that we've done discussing some of the drivers of these differences. But one of them, for example, is in blue here, you can see measurement initiatives often developed by national statistical offices. And in gray, you can see policy initiatives usually led by government ministries, quite often finance or central government, so cabinet office. And one of the reasons why the Stats Office initiatives tend to be larger is that they are really trying to provide the bedrock for monitoring. And you have to monitor a lot of indicators to understand where the problems are. So as a policy ministry, you might identify your top 12 priority areas right now based on what the data are telling you. But if you stick with those 12 forever over time, you won't know what's happening in the rest of your database. So I think the Italian example is quite an interesting one because it's very complementary. You've got a ministry saying these are the top 12 right now that we think we should focus on in the budget context, but that's all underpinned by a much more comprehensive monitoring system that the Statistics Office is running. So despite the fact that these frameworks come in very, very different shapes and sizes, many national initiatives share a common conceptual core that is well captured by the OECD Wellbeing Framework. So this analysis was actually produced in support of recent G7 finance ministers' discussions. That is why there is a G7 focus. It's not an OECD bias. It's simply that we were asked by G7 finance ministries to provide some research and support to them. So we did this analysis of wellbeing frameworks as of today. And you can see on the left-hand side, we've got the OECD framework, the core dimensions of the OECD framework, and then running through, we've got examples from 6 of the 7 G7 countries, selected OECD countries that we were using as benchmarks, and then some selected international efforts on wellbeing monitoring above and beyond the OECD, because we're very much not alone in this space, which is very reassuring for those of us working on it. So what you can see is that almost all of the different dimensions of the OECD approach are captured in the vast majority of these country initiatives. I think where we've got exceptions, things like France, it is largely because France only has 10 indicators. So they can't cover absolutely all of the measures that we have here. But there is still some consistency in key aspects of things like health, subjective well-being, work and job quality, income and wealth, natural capital, human capital, economic capital. Those are very consistent throughout, including even in France. Just looking at the international efforts, we've got the Eurostat quality of life indicators, which are more focused on current well-being. So there is less on sustainability in there. Eurostat has its own sustainability monitoring as well, in addition to the quality of life work. We've got the Human Development Index, which of course only has 3 key components in it. So there's only 3 ticks on the figure here. You've got the SDGs, where there is a lot of conceptual overlap with the wellbeing approach. So the only 2 areas of our framework that are not covered in the SDGs are subjective wellbeing and social connectedness. There's a bit of a gap on social capital, but there are some overlaps. So there is a tick here. The final approach here, WHR, is the World Happiness Report. So I've just included this for contrast because that is a report that focuses very much on subjective well-being as the final outcome of interest. So there's only one tick on this figure. However, again, the World Happiness Report, when it's looking at the drivers of subjective well-being, includes a number of different components of the OECD well-being framework. So there was a nice report written recently, headed up by a team by Liz Ziedler, who summarized some of these initiatives as a greater focus on a thriving, fair, and green economy. So in this slide, I've just tried to explain what that means for OECD countries. So thriving, we see a very broad-based definition of prosperity, including material well-being, income, work, housing. This is really important. Well-being, these are central components to people's well-being. This isn't an either-or scenario. We need both. Thriving can also mean quality of life, so health, subjective well-being, knowledge and skills, environment quality. But thriving also means strong community relations, so social connectedness, work-life balance, feelings of safety, civic engagement, feelings of belonging, feelings of community. On the fair component, this is really about the distribution of outcomes, which tend to feature strongly in almost all of the well-being approaches that we see. It's very often a cross-cutting theme, so it's not necessarily simply about income inequality, and it's not necessarily a kind of dimension on its own. We're going to measure inequality separate to the others. It is usually threaded all the way through. Within the OECD, we look at 3 different types of inequalities. Horizontal inequality is a word that we use to refer to gaps between groups. So whether that's by gender, by age, by education, by income. When it comes to vertical inequality, we're looking at measures that look at the gap between the top and bottom. So an example here might be the income share between the top 20% and the bottom 20%. We also, within the OECD context, collect a lot of data on deprivation, so people falling below a specific threshold on well-being. And again, we try and do this right the way across our framework, so we're not limiting this only to a discussion of income and wealth disparity, important as those are, and we have a lot of work in those areas too. The final component, the green component, is really about the focus on climate, biodiversity, ecosystem assets across these frameworks. So this is about recognizing the amenity value of things like clean air, green spaces, blue spaces, but also the broader stocks of natural assets that support all life on Earth, including people's well-being, but recognizing that these have value in and of themselves above and beyond what they mean for people's well-being. So one last piece on sort of common themes to measurement. You'll probably be familiar with the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission in 2009, but that team largely regathered and produced a report in 2018, which took stock of where we stand on measuring well-being and where we still need to go. Now, a lot of these recommendations will look very familiar because a lot of these recommendations have actually been core to OECD work, but also core to the first report. But it's worth repeating some of the recommendations of that report in terms of the current state of where we think we are. So one recommendation was that no single metric will ever provide a good measure of the health of the country. So the Stiglitz, Fitoussi and Duron Commission, and indeed the original Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, had a really strong focus on a dashboard of indicators. And I think there are many, many different reasons for this, but I think we are also now going forward, and particularly when it comes to integration in policy, looking at how do we simplify some of this complexity? Because a dashboard of 80 indicators is quite hard to operationalize. So, you know, again, as part of the new frontier of actually integrating this into policy decision-making, how do we make a dashboard of 80 indicators operational? What can we do to simplify that complexity? What can we do to really focus in on the things that matter beyond GDP, the things that GDP cannot do? What are the things that we need to do to compensate for that? This report also highlighted that better metrics of people's well-being are relevant for all countries, whatever level of development. And indeed, the OECD We focus on OECD countries in our work, but we've been doing a lot of work with the OECD Development Center to also expand and adapt this approach in developing country contexts. And it seems to work quite well. So there are adaptations needed, especially to the indicator set that you look at, because again, it's really important that you're measuring what matters to people, and you need to adapt the indicator set for the context. But we have seen some quite good uptake. And indeed, there are a number of non-OECD countries who have developed, and well before some OECD countries, developed their own well-being approaches. So this is definitely not a rich country concept. Again, an emphasis on data should be disaggregated. Economic insecurity is an issue that's rising up the agenda, has been on the agenda for many, many years, but is particularly important right now, and more work needs to be done there. Again, there's still quite a lot of work on sustainability still to go. But this report also took the step of recommending that well-being metrics should be used to inform decision-making at every stage of the policy process. So the very last couple of minutes of my talk, how am I doing? We're going to look at some of the work that's been done in OECD and also our member countries on integrating these indicators in a more comprehensive way. Again, pausing for a moment to look at why countries are doing this. I think this is really important. And this slide, this is not an OECD slide. This slide is borrowed from Department of Finance Canada when they set out their quality of life strategy in 2021. This slide sets out why they did that. So what were the key motivations for a Department of Finance in terms of developing a multidimensional wellbeing dashboard? Why did it matter? Of course, the primary motive is better outcomes for people. So refocusing policy efforts on what really matters to people and their quality of life, both today and for future generations. Second, better decision-making. So getting better evidence into the decision-making pipeline of government, especially with more granular data on the diversity of citizens' experiences. Third, a long-term perspective. As I've said before, well-being approaches generally are sustainable development approaches. It is unhelpful to try and imagine a hard distinction between the two. And many of the OECD member countries that we've seen working on well-being have incorporated this very long-term perspective. A number of them are now using the terminology of future generations or sustainability. In terms of government processes, one of the perceived advantages of a well-being approach is to foster horizontal alignment across government. So in a sense, a well-being framework is a way of saying what matters to us as a government, how are we defining policy success? So the idea of having a common vision is to help then align government practices, which sometimes can be in opposition or not optimally aligned, to become more optimally aligned. And that might mean a common set of strategic objectives, but it might also mean putting incentives, for example, in your budget process for departments to collaborate together. One feature that we've seen not only in Canada, but in many other OECD countries is a philosophy of continual improvement. So well-being frameworks, this is a relatively new technology for governments, and the work that's being done right now to integrate them into policymaking is usually done in the spirit of experimentation, the spirit of trying to continuously innovate within government, trying to continuously improve. So the practices that we are seeing today may not be the practices that we see in 10 or 20 years' time, because the whole idea is that this is a process of continual improvement. So I think most countries that are taking steps towards integrating wellbeing evidence will say that they are learning and doing, rather than they've got the perfect solution today off the shelf and everyone can just copy it. We're not there yet. And I think this philosophy of continual improvement in the sense of better upskilling your civil service, building your capacity for doing this type of analysis, that's what's meant by this box here. The last component, and I'm not sure that those in the room can see this, but it's stronger democracy. So using wellbeing frameworks as a way of having a dialogue with citizens about what matters, but then also using them to structure the conversation with stakeholders about the decisions that are taken. So it's not simply tell us what matters, we'll put it in our measurement framework and then you stop. It is very much about saying, okay, if this is how we define policy success, we can be held to account for the decisions we're taking through this framework. And this framework is a way of structuring difficult conversations about trade-offs, whether that's with private sector partners, civil society partners. It is a way of making very transparent the different aspects, the different objectives that a government might have, and a way of actually articulating when those might come into conflict with one another, and then how you resolve that in a way that is democratic rather than purely technocratic. Skipped through again? Maybe not. No. Okay. So what is a well-being approach to policy? I think this is very much not yet defined. The OECD has had a go a couple of times. A few other actors, people like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, have had a couple of goes at defining this. I think there are some common themes emerging. So one is this use of multidimensional frameworks. I don't need to go over that again. Another is a real focus on evidence-based priorities. So using these dashboards to actually set the strategic direction, not just to sort of monitor in a passive way. Again, a long-term focus, I've already talked about that. Integration and collaboration within government, we've already touched on that, and actively connecting to stakeholders. So these were part of the objectives that I set out that Canada's Department of Finance stated, but they are actually quite common themes, common motivations across the different approaches we're seeing. So I mentioned up at the top of this presentation, the 4 Rs, refocus, redesign, realign, and reconnect. This is terminology that we developed in the context of a report that I showed earlier on COVID-19 and well-being. And the idea here is that above and beyond showing the impact of the pandemic on people's well-being, we were also trying to articulate how can you then use that evidence in a policy context to shape the recovery. So refocus was about refocusing policy actions on the outcomes that matter most and the most urgent priorities. And we've got some analysis in the report that shows some common priorities. Redesigning policy content and programs through a multidimensional approach. This is really about looking at trade-offs and synergies across different parts of government objectives. So when you're developing, for example, an education policy, looking at the impact that that might have across a variety of aspects of people's lives, not only looking at education outcomes themselves. So this is really a change in how you think about policy success, but also how you analyze policy options before you hand them up to your ministers for a decision. Realign across government departments. I've already talked about that, and I'll talk about a few of the practical examples. And also then reconnecting people in the public. So again, using these frameworks as a way of framing dialogue. So just to give a couple of examples on this issue of trade-offs and synergies, one thing we tried to do in the report was to identify areas of triple win policy. Now, when I say triple win, I mean it is good for current well-being, it is good for inequalities, and it is good for sustainability. So here we're trying to look at policy pathways that can deliver multiple benefits to people's well-being now and in the future, and crucially to all people, or in particular vulnerable people, rather than just the average. So in the COVID-19 report, these are some of the policy pathways that we identified. This is not a comprehensive list. These were just examples where we can show through OECD evidence that there will be triple benefits to taking these policy actions. And again, this is in the context of where OECD countries currently stand on well-being. So, what are countries themselves doing? I think there's sort of 4 broad categories of activity that we've identified. Now, with the OECD, we partner with countries, but we are at a distance, so there is always a lot going on that we do not know about. And for example, some of Luxembourg's work on the index is not yet in this slide. But this is a sort of collection of activities that we've seen in member countries. Now, I've got details in a paper that I will share in a moment, but one of the areas where we've seen strong attention is around budgeting and fiscal strategy. Now, not every country has got a wellbeing budget, not every country is New Zealand, but a number of OECD countries have taken steps to start putting a real emphasis on these indicators from the perspective of either setting the budget strategy or indeed monitoring the impacts of the budget on selected dimensions of people's well-being. So, for example, in Italy and Canada, the Ministry of Economy or the Ministry of Finance is doing work to analyze the impact of specific budget measures, so specific proposals in the budget. What do they do for selected aspects of people's well-being? So in Italy, it's those 12 indicators I mentioned. In Canada, there's a headline set that you see analysed in their budget documents. Ireland and Australia have recently taken steps in this direction. Ireland is slightly ahead in the sense that they released their wellbeing framework in 2021, and there are various Ministry of I think it's Budget Expenditure and Reform, where they've been looking at how can they integrate this wellbeing framework more systematically through the work that they're doing. We've done some work on budget tagging with Ireland, which is about saying of the budget measures, how do they link to Ireland's wellbeing framework? And Australia has recently announced that they are going to be doing some measurement work on wellbeing in the Treasury in order to shape the budget process. Another area where we've seen a focus is on performance frameworks and strategic coordination. So this might include things like the National Performance Framework in Scotland, some of the indicators that Wales has been using. Again, Ireland is using their framework in a way that is trying to understand how is progress going. We've also seen, for example, Japan produce key performance indicators. I'm just gonna, how are we doing? I will speed up. Policy appraisal and evaluation tools. We've seen, again, a number of countries move in this direction. Thank you. And finally, variety of embedding mechanisms. So a number of countries have implemented legislation and accountability mechanisms. We've seen some countries focusing on capacity building, so really at the civil service level, how do you implement this? And we've seen a number of countries develop coordinating bodies. So in the last 3 minutes, the important thing to say here is that there is no single way of doing this right now. We are seeing a number of different approaches evolve, and a number of different levels of entry and different ministries that are engaged. So there is a lot of activity, but it's not consistent. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of these examples, but this is from the New Zealand Wellbeing Budget, showing how wellbeing evidence is used at every stage in the decision-making process, from high-level strategic decisions all the way through to how they analyse individual budget measures, so individual budget bids. Canada, again, this is an extract from the Canadian budget in 2021, showing how quality of life impacts are now assessed alongside Canada's very famous work on gender budgeting, income distribution, intergenerational impacts. So Canada is now doing a comprehensive analysis of every budget measure according to both quality of life and, of course, these other characteristics that they've been doing for many, many years in Canada now. There are some technical documents produced by treasuries on how to do some of this analysis. And again, lots of links here for those who are keen. And the last thing I wanted to talk about very briefly was using a wellbeing lens to look at very specific policy topics. So, for example, we have a project in OECD at the moment all about mental health and wellbeing. So looking at how all the different dimensions of our wellbeing framework interact with mental health outcomes, and then looking at what are the integrated policy approaches that are good for people's mental health and good for people's well-being. So how can we move forward the conversation on mental health and look at the upstream drivers through a well-being lens? Again, there's an example here of how we can use the 4 Rs in a mental health context. We are also working on built environment and well-being, a similar approach. Finally, our Environment Directorate is doing some work on how we can use a wellbeing lens to reframe and reassess how we move forward on net zero. So using a wellbeing lens to encourage systems thinking, managing complexity and trade-offs and synergies. They've done some detailed work on transport systems to try and show this in practice, but there is also a more general approach that's outlined in this document called Accelerating Climate Action, and that is refocusing policies through a well-being lens. So, lessons learned. Building well-being into policy requires a solid ecosystem behind it. This cannot just be goodwill from a particular minister or goodwill from one part of one government department. There needs to be a whole ecosystem supporting it. That means tools, so frameworks, but also analytical and decision-making tools, legislation, coordination mechanisms. It means processes, so cross-government collaboration, civil service capacity building, public and stakeholder engagement, having the wider public holding you to account, but also integrating this in parliamentary debate, getting this on the radar at the political level. Finally, incentives, so strong leadership from central government, accountability mechanisms, investment in cross-department programs, better decision-making, improved outcomes. All of this needs to be underpinned by a solid multidisciplinary evidence base on what works. And I think that's the people in this room who have a vital role to play in feeding the ecosystem that supports wellbeing policy. I want to say two more things. Can I be allowed to say two more things? We are developing a knowledge exchange platform at the OECD to try and support member governments who are wanting to move forward with their wellbeing work. So whether they're at the stage of developing wellbeing initiatives and frameworks, or whether they are at the stage where they have all of that, and what they want to do is know, how can we use this more systematically, more comprehensively in our policy making? So I've shared a couple of quick examples there. And what we want to do is provide a place for exchange across our member countries to move the conversations forward and to share the lessons learned so far. Another really important thing, another important pillar of our work is supporting countries to have dialogues around this in multinational fora. So very recently, we were asked by the Japan Ministry of Finance to help them with the G7 finance track. We were supporting several different discussions at ministerial and deputies level on well-being in multidimensional frameworks beyond GDP. And this link is a report that we prepared for the May ministerial for the finance ministers in Japan. And that has a lot of detail on some of the initiatives that I've provided in these slides. So if you want a summary document that more or less is a takeaway of all the things I've said today, this is the place to go. And a couple more references too. But thank you very much, and thank you for the extra time.
Okay, thanks, Carrie, for this very interesting and heartening and enthusiastic presentation about what's happening in the policy world as regards all these initiatives. And it's fantastic for me to see how much has happened in the last 10 years in terms of different initiatives, different things that are being measured, different policy proposal, and so on. My question would be, and you've done that to some extent at the end of your presentation, when you talked about the different levels of entry and the necessity to have an ecosystem supporting all these things in different countries. My question to you would be, to what extent are you doing this, or think it is a good idea to maybe measure and rank the actual implementation of these initiatives? Because when you had that table with the blue check marks, what each country is measuring and doing, I've seen my home country and I've seen all blue or mostly blue, and I was like, that warms my heart. But then this lingering doubt of the black-hearted economist came into me, and I was thinking, I haven't seen, this is ad hoc empiricism now, I haven't seen a lot of initiatives in my country that would, for instance, check this subjective well-being box. And I have that lingering suspicion that some of these might be lip service, and maybe it could be good, or it could be an interesting thing to put a little bit of pressure on the participants at some point by actually trying to measure to what extent this goes into the policy process. I think it's great we have this all, but I'm wondering, do you have evidence? And you had that, but it didn't seem systematic at the end when you said, this is happening in this country, this is happening in that country. Maybe there's a way to actually rank and measure that. Would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Finbar Burton from University College Dublin in Ireland. Thank you for a fabulous presentation. I've been working in this area for nearly 20 years, so I think that was a fabulous summary of what's going on. I mean, I guess my question is, in terms of the measurement and cross-country comparability of indices, etc. in the different countries, OECD, European Union. I mean, I mainly work in the environmental area, and the issues within the European Union, comparing, contrasting data within countries. And I give the example of the European Union's noise directive and the challenges of getting comparable data because of differences in measurement. Countries are measuring noise pollution in different ways from different levels, etc. And that's where you have the European Commission, who can mandate the direction, the way of measurement, etc. The OECD doesn't have that power. So you mentioned you're trying to work towards comparability. I'm wondering, is that even possible? I mean, I guess I don't want to sound downhearted, but if the European Commission is struggling to do it and they have the power to mandate it, where the OECD does not have that, I just wonder, will we still have these issues in 2030 when I'm retired? Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, great talk. Really interesting stuff. I just wanted to pick up on some stuff from earlier in the talk. So you mentioned that the OECD is hoping to develop some tools for policymakers to use. And then you also mentioned connecting to stakeholders in the private and third sector. I was wondering what policymakers the OECD is talking to, like what kind of ministries do they come from? What level of government are they operating at? And similarly with the stakeholders, who do you have in mind? And then what are some of these tools that you're hoping to develop? So if you could just tell me a bit more about where the demand is and what the nature of that demand is. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. I just want to echo the thank you. I'm excited to go back to these slides later on. My name is Tiffany Ford. I'm here from the US, from the Brookings Institution and the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health. And my question, I guess, is kind of similar to Mark's. It's about, you talked about well-being and policy as being, a useful approach because it helps to promote a stronger democracy. You talked about the ability to actively connect with stakeholders. And, the question that kind of came up in the back of my head is like, to what extent are you connecting with like individual constituents, like individual community members, and what does that look like? Because you also talked a lot about just the strength of the published evidence that is going into informing the measures that are included. And yeah, so I'm wondering, to what extent are you considering individual community members as folks who are informing the measures that are included, and maybe not only sort of on the back end of the recipients of the information that has been aggregated?
Great, excellent set of questions. I could probably do another whole 45 minutes on this, so you're going to have to stop me. So on this point about measuring implementation, I think that would be a fantastic project. I think we're a couple of steps away from that at the moment, in the sense that the very first thing we need is to have a taxonomy and to understand what is it really that we're talking about when we're talking about wellbeing policy implementation. So I think where the OECD is at the moment is we are very active on trying to gather up these examples, build some of these classifications, understand what that taxonomy looks like. And I think once we have really persuasive evidence on that, maybe the next step would be to say, well, how are countries doing across these different ones? Again, it's very easy on measurement, which is why we do it and we can do it. It's very easy when a National Statistical Office publishes data and you can say, well, is this indicator there or not? That's a very factual exercise. The OECD is definitely engaged in trying to do these taxonomies of policy practice. We have a public governance directorate with deep expertise on things like how you measure, is a government doing stakeholder engagement? Is a government doing a variety of other things? So there is expertise in-house that we can tap. But I think before we can do that, we have to have a much crisper understanding of what is it exactly that we're trying to understand is being implemented. I think we are making progress, but I don't think we're quite there yet. But what we are doing is trying to document what's out there. And I think that is the very first step. And there are a number of initiatives where we can show that it sort of stops at measurement. And there are a number of countries where they're coming forward with examples that we can show it's going much beyond measurement. And again, I mean, we don't have a comprehensive knowledge of everything that's happening in our member countries. To do the exercise you're talking about, we would need them to fully engage and supply all of that information, because my fear whenever I'm up here standing in front of people is that I'm highlighting examples that I know about based on the networks that we have, but there's a lot of things happening that we do not know. And it's only through talking in this way that we can actually elicit those examples. And I really hope that this knowledge exchange platform that we're developing will also really help in that regard and actually get many more countries coming forward saying, well, we don't call it well-being, but we're doing this thing and it looks a lot like the thing you're talking about. I think there are many, many of those examples out there and we need to surface them better. So on measurement and cross-country comparability, it is a mountain to climb. The OECD does not have the power that the European system has. However, we do have national statisticians of all our member countries who meet regularly and who oversee our work. So we provide space for dialogue among countries. They can identify what their priorities are, which then goes into our program of work. So things like the measurement work that we've done on subjective well-being or trust, that has bubbled up through demand from our member countries who say, we're interested in this, we're all doing it differently. Can you help us prepare some guidelines so that we know that we're doing it right? And that does happen. Like I want to tell a positive story. There are many gaps. I will not deny there are many gaps. There are many places we want to do so much better and we want to move much faster. Crucially, we want more frequent and timely data. And I will bang that drum long and hard because, again, economic indicators, we want to match economic indicators that currently kind of inform many, many policy processes. If we want to match that, we have to match the frequency and timeliness. So there is progress and there is probably soft power. But I think, again, our focus is on consensus building. So we don't dictate, but what we do is try and help move things forward. Mark, tools for policymakers. What levels of government? So the OECD interacts as an organization with so many different bits of government. So the way we are structured is in forms of committees, and different ministries are represented on those different committees. So the work of the OECD WISE Centre reports to the Statistics Committee, because we've got this work on measurement, and also to the Working Party on Social Policy, which is under Employment, Labour and Social Affairs. So we have a strong connect with Employment, Labour and Social Affairs ministries through this kind of formal structure. However, on wellbeing, a lot of the bits of government that we're interacting with are around Ministry of Finance or maybe Cabinet Office. These ministries have relations with the OECD and with other bits of the OECD. And one of the things we're trying to do with this knowledge exchange platform is connect up all of those different communities. So much like governments, the OECD is siloed. We're an expert-led organization. Expertise tends to kind of gravitate towards silos. But one of the things we are actively trying to do is connect up all of these conversations. So some of the examples I shared around work on environment and well-being, that is being led by our Environment Directorate, who interacts with environment ministries. Some of our work on child well-being, and child well-being is going into, for example, our famous PISA study. That is all overseen by education ministries. So there are many, many different ministries that we are interacting with on well-being issues. It's not limited to the ones that WISE talks to, because well-being is really becoming more integrated across OECD activities and advice, but there isn't a way of connecting up these communities at the moment. So we're really hopeful that this knowledge exchange platform will be a really flexible structure. In terms of, you asked specific tools, I think some of the areas we've seen activity on, and some of the areas where I think we know there is demand, is things like adapting cost benefit analysis, adapting the way that budget measures are analysed. I think things like appraisal and evaluation of policy, because these are key decision-making tools. So if you want to change how decisions are made, you need to look at the types of tools that economists are regularly using to change those decisions. But I think there's all sorts of softer tools. And I would probably here highlight something like the Welsh government's ways of working, where explicitly as part of their wellbeing approach, they've tried to kind of encapsulate what does it mean for the Welsh Civil Service to meet their duty under the Future Generations Act, which puts duties on public bodies in Wales to know what they are doing for people's well-being. But the Future Generations Commissioner and also the General Auditor in Wales then provides support. So it's not just a stick, there is also a carrot that says, how do we support the public service to actually implement what we have demanded in the Act, there is also various mechanisms to help, again, build these communities of practice. I think that's a stage where we're really at the frontier where it is essential to start connecting up all of these different conversations. Tiffany, on connecting at the community level. So the OECD does try and do this. One of the things that actually put us on the map in terms of well-being was something called the Better Life Index, which is an interactive website. We've had over 10 million users come to that website, and that is a place where you can build your own index of well-being, and you can tell the OECD what you think is most important for your index of well-being. So you get the 11 dimensions of well-being, and you can say how important they are to you. It then produces an OECD country ranking, so you can see which country does best on your personal index. And we have been collecting data from people who are willing to share their information with us. We've been collecting data on what people's preferences are being, how those preferences are being expressed. But I will say, like a lot of international organizations, we probably don't do community engagement the way that many of our member countries can. And again, one of the features of developing these wellbeing frameworks across almost all of our member countries is a really strong emphasis on engaging with civil society in the development of the measures. Now, again, I said this earlier, but I think it's one step to say, help us define and measure. It's another step again to say, now help us use it. And we do have some examples in the COVID-19 report that I described. We've got some examples both with the private sector and with civil society groups of how you can actually engage communities in using the measures to influence decisions, not just in how you measure progress. There was also a question about private sector, and I should just flag the WISE Centre is doing work with the private sector, both from a perspective of how you measure impact, how you measure employee well-being, but also all sorts of aspects of inequalities and sustainability. So we've got quite long-standing connections. And again, the OECD's got various mechanisms for engaging with the private sector. So this is well-being is not something that a government can do on its own. We need all parts of society engaged. And again, I think that's an important lesson, and I will stop there because I'll get into real trouble with the coffee break.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. It sounds really inspiring. And I'm particularly curious about the idea of triple wins. You mentioned it somewhere in the middle of the talk, and it sounds like a fantastic objective of policy evaluation. But I was curious to hear your thoughts on what are the ways to make it operational, in the sense that are we choosing the policies that improve 2 of the 3 or all 3, or are there any trade-offs? And in a sense, how we can compare policies that affect different current, future inequalities in different ways.
Yeah, thank you. That was super inspiring. Most of us here, I think, are academics working on self-reported well-being. So my question simply is, what can we do that's most useful to the OECD? And what do you think is most useful to national governments from the perspective of self-reported well-being? What's the knowledge gap, for example?
I have a quick one. Impact. So another way to think about it compared to Martin's is the take-up. So in the private sector, among governments, and maybe relative to GDP, are we winning the battle maybe slowly in changing the focus?
Triple wins. We specifically required the policy areas that we included in the report to hit all 3. So it didn't make the cut if it only hit 2. But I'll be very, very honest. We do not yet have the methodology for really systematically identifying these triple wins. This was a very organic way of looking through OECD reports, saying, okay, where do we have evidence on this? And how does that link to evidence in this report? So I think we need a much better methodology for identifying these triple wins. And that means, crucially, having evidence of how a specific policy action impacts multiple aspects of people's well-being. So, and my minimum is to understand current inequalities and future. So at a minimum, if we're talking about how do you make this operational, At a minimum, you need some evidence of how a policy is going to impact well-being today, well-being for future generations, and inequalities. And if you can hit all of those components, then that might qualify as a triple win. But the devil is always in the detail. And the other thing I want to say is that it's about how you implement a policy, not just how you design it. So we cannot stop at appraising something and doing an econometric analysis that shows this will have this impact, because the devil is always in the detail. The devil is always in how you actually enact that policy and how you bring people with you. So what I want to see, in addition to the tools I've been talking about before in terms of adapting the economist's toolbox, we need to also then see how a well-being approach changes how you implement policy, how you deliver policy on the ground. And again, the COVID-19 report had a couple of examples of delivery on the ground in a way that is consistent with the principles of well-being that I was outlining. Self-reported well-being, what are the key things? One very important way that you can help us right now is on the measurement of subjective well-being and moving forward on that measurement piece that I talked about. So there's a very positive story to tell in terms of the movement we've seen in national statistical offices towards measuring subjective well-being. But the second thing I would do is say use their data, because we have now got almost all OECD member countries producing at least life satisfaction data on a regular basis. I know the time series isn't always perfect, but the granularity is very good usually, because this is National Statistical Office data. We're talking really large samples. We're talking a lot of really good variables to play with. I know Stats Office data isn't always very easily available, but again, Stats Offices are making big efforts to try and make data more available for the research community. Again, as part of the subjective wellbeing work that I mentioned, we are documenting all of the different data that is out there and available to people, in the hope that also the research community is going to grab this and do some of the analysis that's missing. I think other things I would highlight is identifying where subjective well-being really changes the decision you would make. That is a really helpful thing to be able to say. So to be able to take a policy and say, rather than doing this, we would do this instead if we followed subjective well-being. I think surfacing those examples from really good quality research will be really important. The last thing I think we really need to square on subjective well-being, and I'm delighted to see it featuring so strongly in the program, is the relation with the environment. Because again, we can do a lot on inequalities with subjective well-being. There's a lot of really rich inequalities data we can produce with subjective well-being, but squaring that with the sustainability and telling that story and explaining that, I think, will be really important to kind of, again, bridge the communities. Rather than having subjective well-being in its silo, how do we bridge the communities? That will be really important. Impact and take-up. I think we are definitely making progress on the battle. Are we winning it yet? I'm not sure. But we as an organization can also only move as fast as our members. So again, it takes a community, it takes a society to change this. No one single organization, no matter how clever they are, is going to be able to change this. It's a whole of society agenda. It's not just politics. It's not just civil society. It's not just business. It's everybody saying, we want a different way of understanding what success looks like. And I think I want to be optimistic. I think things have changed so much in the 12 or 13 years I have been working on this. Really, so much very positive movement, and especially in stats offices and in governments. So I really hope that we're moving in a positive direction, but there is a lot more work to be done.
That's good. Just maybe one last remark, and maybe to ponder upon during the coffee break. And thank you for the very good presentation. I think you also highlight all the challenges. No one size fits all, no taxonomy, very different approaches, a lot of fragmentation in the way governments go about this. And I think it's an unequal battle. So you have, on the one hand, you have a GDP, universal indicator applied everywhere. On the other hand side, you have a very diversified bunch of policies and approaches to it and to measuring progress. And and also about integrating well-being into the discussion. So wondering if it's not, if it would not be worthwhile at least to think about a correction to GDP on very minimal targets. I think everybody agrees that environment is not in there, and also minimal social standards. I don't know technically how you would go about this, but to have sort of a GDP plus, where you basically would have at least correct these two flaws by having a kind of a minimal environmental correction to GDP, and also in terms of social standards, for instance, minimum wage or minimum living wage that would somehow be within the GDP itself. Because if you do not, if you do not do that, you will have, and I know how it works in Luxembourg. We can all agree that well-being is important, and we should look at this. But at the end of the day, we only look at GDP. That's all we do. And also in our inflation numbers, you mentioned the index. Everybody's riveted by GDP, and so I'm just afraid that if we do not do something about this indicator, somehow play with it, we will not, as Kelsey also mentioned, will be difficult to really make progress.
Should I respond to that quickly? So a very quick response. One thing I really should flag, which is sort of happening in parallel to these dashboards, is work within the system of national accounts itself, which is the system that the UN kind of has the pen on. The OECD is very involved in this, but that is the system of data through which GDP is produced. And there is activity to improve the underlying data sets there. So two really important things. There's work on better valuing unpaid work. So unpaid work is work delivered that's not remunerated in the market. So things like unpaid household work. So how do we reflect that in the value numbers that we're generating through the system of national accounts? But also things like the system of environmental and economic accounting, which is aiming to price up the natural assets that support well-being. So there is activity within the community of people who are generating these GDP statistics. There is activity within the system of national accounts to improve that bedrock that we're working on. There are also a whole range of technical solutions to the adapted GDP. So the academic community has tried to integrate. And I think the challenge always becomes that you want to make these non-GDP or non-market components more visible when you're assessing how progress is going. Because if you just have a single number, if that's improving, you don't know why. You always have to decompose to understand how the different bits are moving. And even if GDP incorporated all of these other things, it can still go up through the traditional market routes that we have now, and you can still have worsening in other areas, and the aggregate number could still go up if there's enough compensation between them. So the analogy that's often used is driving a car, and a single number that adds together your speed, your remaining fuel, your direction of travel could be quite misleading. And when it comes to driving a car, we're all quite happy to accept that you need a dashboard that gives you sort of multiple indicators to keep you on the road and keep you safe. I think running a country is at least as complicated as driving a car. So we might need a dashboard in order to kind of give us a full sense of where we're going. Having said that, I think I really, really recognize the power of these single numbers to shift the conversation. And there is certainly a lot of work going into improving those numbers. And I want to give the System of National Accounts folks their dues in terms of the work that they are doing. But there is, again, a long way to go.